Okay, so hello everyone and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Diana Ospina and I will be your host for today. Today's topic is Standard Product Costing, 3 Methods to Absorb Overhead, presented by Robert Leatham. Robert is an SAP professional with 16 years international ERP experience across the US, Mexico, Canada, Brazil, China, Japan, Africa, and Europe, and cross-industry projects involving high-tech financial services, software, consumer products, and manufacturing industries. His expertise and experience includes 7 full lifecycle projects integrated with cloud and on-premise ERM, CRM, SRM, PLM, and custom systems. Robert currently is a domain architect for a Fortune 500 company. And without any further ado, I will now pass this over to Robert to begin the webinar.
Hi Diana, it's Rob here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, Rob.
Okay, great. So I'm going into presentation mode now. If you let me know if we can see the screen.
Yep, I can see it here.
Okay, excellent. Hi. Good morning everyone on the call. Diana, thanks for the introduction. My name is Rob Leatham and today we're going to just look at some different methods to absorb overhead in standard product costing, as this is really an essential part of costing. This will be an overview as opposed to a deep dive, and then we can always respond to more detailed questions later. Okay, let's click in here on the slides. Okay, we've done the intro. So in terms of overhead, we know this is an essential part of standard costing itself, but often on a project you get various decision sticking points or questions about how we apply overhead and to avoid the dreaded peanut butter scenario where you apply overhead in a very blunt way to all products. So very often I hear on projects, and you may have this on your own specific projects, is are all products in the same plant getting the same rate, and is this something that you actually want? So common questions that arrive is, how do I selectively apply overhead in SAP when products are in the same place or in the same factory environment? How do I adjust for different products that are on the same production line? You might have a very common production line going through, but some products might absorb a lot more overheads than others, and you might be struggling to decide what is the best way to differentiate different products in terms of the way they absorb overhead. The other one is how do I manage my master data complexity? If you have very simple rules applying a very standard overhead rate to all products, this could be quite simple, but as you want to get more complex and to have varying different rates, you need to think about how do I manage my master data to at least get the rates effectively applied and not have errors or problems with your costing process. Another common area that we have is that in SAP, many of you are maybe familiar with the standard SAP costing sheet. In its simplest form, many people may look at a costing sheet and think this isn't flexible enough for what I need. So really what we're going to look at today is to go through some details and see how do we address some of these misconceptions and what some other options are. So you may have questions about how do I apply my percentage-based overhead, how do I apply different percentages as opposed to being stuck with only one percentage for an entire plant as per the screenshot there. What happens if you need to apply some quantity-based overhead and not percentages? And also, how do you think about activity-based overhead? On the face of it, if you look at your standard costing sheet, it's not obvious how you would do anything using activity-based. So these are really common things that come up in projects. So let's see what we can do having those questions in mind. So if we look at the, I'm going to call it the anatomy of a standard costing sheet, the main element you have is your base in your costing sheet. In its simplest fashion, you would have a range of cost elements, and these are really all your inputs into your standard costing process. The most common would be your material consumption accounts as your cost elements, and you could also include other things like secondary cost elements in here, but the main thing is you have a base with which you want to apply overhead to. Second main element of the costing sheet is your overhead rate. So the way that the standard SAP system works is you have a base as your input, and then you apply a rate to that base. in its simplest form in this example here, we have one rate that is going to be applied to every product in a specific plant. So this would be an example where you had low complexity, and this would be a low overhead on master data, but it might not be flexible enough for your specific environment. We'll go through some more detail later, but just to make you aware that you aren't only stuck with a percentage overhead. In the costing sheet, there are options to use fixed amounts for different units of measure of cost elements, for instance, a fixed amount per piece or per hour, depending on the cost element being used. And then the final element of the costing sheet is the credit key. So this is really the mechanism in the controlling area of SAP where once you are applying that overhead, this is the cost center that is getting the credit as the overhead is being absorbed, and the secondary cost element that is going to be involved to transport or trace that absorption of the overhead. So these are the three main elements of a standard costing sheet, and then depending on the flexibility you need, you've got different options of how you can use these, or there are other options as well. So on that, I'm going to take you through three main options that I see that are common in terms of addressing your overhead absorption. So solution option number one I'm going to talk about is really what I would call the complex costing sheet. So in this case, instead of having a costing sheet with only one flat base with the range of cost elements, one overhead rate per plant, and one credit key, you can actually have multiple rows to add capability to your costing sheet. By having multiple rows, what I mean is that you can have multiple bases. In the example we looked at before, we had one range of cost elements only, but we didn't really differentiate much more on that basis. So a point to note is that you can have multiple bases, i.e. multiple rows. They can be different ranges of cost elements. In your material consumption accounts, you can add secondary cost elements, i.e. machine and labor type costs. But it's important to note you can also use the origin group if you use this in your material master record, that you can then differentiate, for instance, raw materials from packaging. So one base row could be raw materials using cost element ranges in the origin group. The other one could be packaging. So origin group is used if you have got the same material consumption account across all of your materials. If you have different cost elements, then that does make it easier. But just to be aware that you can break up the bases to give you more options. Once you have separate bases, you then have the ability to apply different overhead rates to those bases. So the standard method is the percentage rate, which we saw in the earlier example, but it is possible to use fixed amounts, as I mentioned, depending on the unit of measure. So common usage here would be like per piece if it was materials, or you could use things like hours if you were using activities. Basically, for every base that you have above, you can apply a different overhead rate. But one key thing I want to point out is that the rate that we looked at before was applied to the entire plant. But there's a technique in SAP where you can assign your overhead rates to an overhead key, which can then be assigned to an overhead group and then to the material master record. So in this way, instead of having the same percentage rate applying to everything in the plant, you can then use this overhead key, overhead group concept, and then use your material master record to decide which materials in the plant are going to get this overhead applied at a specific rate, maybe your 25% that we saw, or others could have a lesser rate, say 10%, if they've got a different nature of the way that they're produced in the plant. Using this technique does increase the master data maintenance that you need, as this is a field in the material master record, but it does give you a way to selectively apply the overhead to different materials and not be stuck with only one flat overhead rate for the entire plant. So this is a synopsis of your first option in level of complexity is that the standard costing sheet is more capable than you might have originally anticipated, and you do have these options to give yourself more capability. The one limitation on the costing sheet, though, to note here is that all of these rates and bases are already applied to input costs or input quantities only into the standard cost estimate. There's nothing in the standard costing sheet that allows you to really use outputs or confirmations out of a production order type process. You are really basing all of these calculations on the input costs that are coming into the process. So let's see what other options are available. Solution option number 2 is called the overhead template. So the overhead template in SAP is based on activity-based costing capability in SAP, and it really provides a lot of flexibility, and you may not be familiar with this solution. We're not going to look at this one in a lot of detail, but it's to give you a flavor of what's available, as this is a more complex area and it's really got infinite possibilities. But the main technique or the takeaway I want you to understand is you basically create a template which is really called a type 1 in this case, which means it applies to cost elements, cost estimates or production orders. And this is actually attached to a costing sheet. But in this method in SAP, the costing sheet here is purely a method to attach the template. The overhead calculation is still fully performed in the template, and there are actually no rows in the costing sheet itself. There's no concept of that old base and credit key, etc. that you saw before. It's really all contained in the template itself. The main advantage of this template, and we'll have a look at one just now, is that you can apply very complex formula and functions. You can use input or output quantities, and you can apply mathematical functions, and you can have different lookups to look at the order, the BOM, the material, the routing, etc. You can really look at different data points in the system to decide how you want to apply the overhead. So, as an example, you could say in your functional formula, I want you to look at the material master record, I want you to look at the material group, and if the material group is a certain value, then I want you to apply, a certain rate or overhead. And at the end of the day, once you've got this template set up, it is then also selectively assigned to materials via the overhead key overhead group. So you can, again, even with this complexity, decide which materials are actually going to be tagged to this overhead template or which ones are not going to have overhead applied. So let's have a look to see what one of these templates actually looks like in the system and discuss that a little bit. So for the template itself, we have different sections of the template. So we've got the template name over here, and here's this type 1 template. And this is the key definition, because templates are used in different areas of SAP, and this is really a template that can be applied to cost estimates or production orders. And we've listed the SAP transaction codes that you can find later. In this, I provided a simple example of where I'm going to apply some cost center activity, and in this case I've decided to multiply it by the BOM lot size. So how is this accomplished? In the template, there's one row here where I've specifically picked that this type of overhead is a cost center activity type, and I've linked that to a cost center activity that's already been existing, which is this cost center 4210, and this activity 1420 is my machine hours. So this piece here is using the standard CO activity rate that's been planned on a cost center, but the extra trick or the magic here from this template is that what do I want to apply this to? In this case, I chose the BOM lot size just as an arbitrary item that I've chosen, but the main thing to understand here is in the template there's this function hierarchy here. So any of these elements down here, and I've just exploded the order one as an example, are different options that you can use in your formula. So in this example, if I just clicked on order BOM lot size, it automatically brought that function into this text editing box on the left-hand side. This left-hand pane, think of this as a formula text editor. So although we've only put in one function here, you can then essentially write code without any ABAP and put whatever logic you need in here. You can have if, then, else statements, you can have mathematical formula, and you can be quite complex or selective in this left-hand pane. So this is something that you would need to explore in a lot more detail, open up these different pins in the hierarchy, try out different functions, and you can then quickly see that this is really got infinite combinations for you to apply. In this example as well, I only showed one row for this overhead, but this template can have as many rows as you like. There's a scroll down section in the screen, and so that you can create multiple templates and multiple rows, and they can all be tagged to the same costing sheet placeholder and then assigned to the materials. So you're not limited by only one row or by only one particular function that I've shown here. So this is really, without any coding, is the, I would see it as the most powerful standard method of applying overhead very selectively without any ABAP coding. So this is the overhead template methodology in SAP. So if we then look at another option that's available, so just a fine one here, I wanted to just clarify here as well. In order to assign these templates to the material master, I mentioned this overhead key overhead group concept from the complex costing sheet and the template. In order to selectively apply overhead to materials and not have the overhead be peanut butter or blanket for every material in the same plant, this is the field here, the overhead group field in the material master, where you can then assign the overhead. So this is, it adds to your master data maintenance, but this allows you to be very selective about which products are going to attract the calculations that you've done in the costing sheet or not. So this is how the overhead is attached. So moving on from the template, what is the third option we can use? So we had the regular SAP costing sheet with extra rows and bases. We've now had the template methodology, which although linked to the costing sheet, is really got its own internal logic. This option here, called the routing or task list, does not rely on the costing sheet at all or a template, but it does rely on you having a production routing in your system, which is an additional piece of master data. But if your site has internal production, then this really would be a standard method or standard master data that would be in place. So how would this work? The system itself, we would stick with the normal planned activity types and rates in our system instead of a costing sheet. So if you had planned machine hours, quality inspection hours, activities like that in the system, you can use those planned types and rates to apply your overhead. When you apply them, you really get the standard value that you have planned per production order output. And the flexibility here as well is that it can be based on the outputs, i.e. the quantity of finished goods being confirmed. Whereas if you recall from the costing sheet, you were often limited to the input quantities. So as an example here, you can also have different rates for different product lines. You can flex them up and down, and I'll show an example. But what I mean by that is you could have a unit of quality inspection. Let's just say that was at $8 an hour for quality inspection. In the routing, for product X, you could say you need 1 unit or 1 hour of quality inspection. But for a different product, for instance product Y, you could say that this product is more complex, it takes more time to inspect. You could say that you need 5 units of quality inspection. So although you only have one standard rate that is planned for quality inspection hours, you can flex the amount up or down for how much gets applied to different products. So this is very useful in order to differentiate different products in the same line or in the same plant. So let's have a look about in SAP itself what that looks like. So the first part in order to get the overhead applied is to actually calculate your planned cost center activity rates. This is the standard SAP planning screen, KP26, which you may already be using. In this example, there was a price here of $8,000 per 1,000 units of machine activity, so $841 per hour of activity planned on this cost center 4200. So this would be part of your normal planning cycle, and you can have as many activities planned as you require. And then this is really how the attachment mechanism, or where the magic kicks in, is that the routing or task list, which is typically maintained by the production team, is broken up into a series of operations. So you might have different operations, which is your, let's just say, mixing, packing, cutting, different areas of your manufacturing. You can either insert the activities that you need during those operations, or it can also be common to have an operation dedicated purely for overhead if you just want to collect the overhead at the end of the process, as an example, when finished goods are confirmed. So in this example, what we've said here is for this particular product, this light bulb here, when you go through the production process, I want you to apply 35 minutes of machine overhead per 1 unit of output. And so this way we've got your planned activity rate on the cost center that we saw as your standard value that can be applied, and in this case we're going to apply 35 minutes worth of that activity. And as I mentioned before, if you had, for instance, a different light bulb or different products going through that line, this 35 value here can go up or down because this is just a quantity, and that's the multiplier according to your standard rate. So this routing or task list is very flexible. The main limitation here is that you can only have 6 different activities per operation. So if you had a really large amount of activities that you wanted to build into the overhead, you would either need to split them across multiple operations, or you might consider a template if your need is more complex than using the 6 in one particular operation. So in summary, I would say that keep it simple when a common absorption rate is useful, i.e. if you've got fairly simple requirements in a particular plant, using a costing sheet and applying a specific percentage rate to all products in the plant is very easy, low master data maintenance. This can be a good strategy. But where you have product variation and it's driving cost differences, this is where you can start to add complexity. And here you can decide, am I going to increase the complexity of my costing sheet? Do I need to take it to the next level and go to the template complexity, which is the most, I would say, the most powerful option that you've got without using ABAP? Or could you use a routing or task list to also achieve activity-based costing principles, but without having to go as complex as a template? So as soon as you need, I would say, activity rates and different input bases where you need to think about how I want to use, the output of a production process versus the input as my base, and I need more flexibility, then those are the 3 methods that you can use in order to apply your overhead in the most correct way, or the one that most accurately reflects your costs. So that's the main content that I wanted to get across this morning, and I wanted to leave some time for questions of anybody on the webinar who wants to ask any specifics, and we can also do more detailed follow-up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. We do have a question here. Just pull that up. So the question comes from Aid. He asked, when using the credit key to apply OH based on the cost center activity allocation, KP26, what is the easiest way to credit the sending cost center and not just a single cost center? Currently, the limitation of the credit key is force the credit into a single cost center bucket.
So a good question. I think generally, if you have different percentage rate rows in the costing sheet, then you can have a different credit key per percentage row. So multiple rows will allow you some options to get more than one credit key, which enables you to then target different cost centers. But if that isn't flexible enough for you, then there is also a user exit one can look into. Otherwise, I think that you would probably need to think about a template in order to get more complex, but I understand what you mean by that limitation. So I would say you need to break out the overhead rates into different rows so you can have different credit keys, or potentially consider a user exit, which there is a standard one available.
Great, thank you. And we have another question here from Jadav. Is there any reconciliation report that we run to verify what is to be absorbed is absorbed by all products?
If you're thinking of, if I'm understanding the question correctly, there is a reconciliation report one can run on the planning side of SAP if you have planned the overhead. I don't have the transaction code to hand, but there's a report that can run that would be able to show if you've planned the quantities that you can see what the planned absorption would be. But I think probably needs some more detailed follow-up on that. But I would say it depends on how detailed your planning is, and if your planning itself is within SAP ECC itself, then you should be able to do that calculation.
Great. Now we have another question here from Aid. What if we want the OH to credit the cost center that sent the original base cost to the cost object?
If you want to create the original cost center, I think there would probably be more detailed follow-up aid for me to understand what you're trying to do there. I think generally with the overhead, you want to move your cost to an overhead cost pool, and then you want to absorb the overhead off that overhead cost pool. So I would think that if you want to credit an original cost center that's preceding the cost pool, then I think you need to question why you have the cost pool itself. So I think one would need to try and look at that overall flow to see, for me to try and understand that better. But basically, you have to pick the cost pool that you want to get the recovery from. I don't see how you could do it from an upstream one without removing the cost pool itself.
Okay.
So I think maybe on that one we could get a more follow-up in detail to try and understand the flow of the cost through that process to answer that more effectively.
Right, and again, your contact information is also here and available for anyone that wants to contact you directly. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, I have another one here. Can I use a combination of the 3 different overhead methods?
Yes, it is possible. I think especially with the mixing the use of a costing sheet and the routing task list, these are easily combinable as they are 2 separate objects. I would say that if you want to use the template and a regular costing sheet, you would probably need to look at how you are assigning the costing sheet to your valuation variant in your costing run. If you have different valuation variants, then you can tag different costing sheets. So I think that would be the consideration there. But if you want to use a costing sheet in combination with a routing task list, yeah, this is a very common thing to do. That's not a problem at all.
Great. I have one more question here. Can I use more than one costing sheet?
You can use more than one costing sheet, yes, and I say the main thing there would be, again, you would need to just consider your valuation variant, which is where the costing sheet gets attached. If you've got only one valuation variant, then I would say you are then pretty much locked into one costing sheet. If you have multiple valuation variants, then you can use more than one costing sheet.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? This will be your last chance. Okay. As I mentioned, Rob's contact information is on the latch sheet. I will also be sending a copy of this webinar to everyone who attended and registered. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And Robert, thank you very much.
Sure, thanks Diana, and thanks everyone for attending, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you need some more information. Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone.